What if the Bible only told you half the story of the flood, and the other half was buried in a text so dangerous, ancient scribes refused to let it survive? There is a text that early rabbis tried to erase from memory. Church councils centuries later did the same, not because it was boring, not because it was irrelevant, but because it answered a question that institutional religion has never fully wanted to answer. Where did evil truly begin, and why did God respond with a flood instead of a warning? The Book of Giants doesn't read like scripture as you know it. It reads like a war record. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, tucked away in caves for nearly 2,000 years, written in Aramaic, describing something the Book of Genesis only hints at in a handful of verses. Genesis 6:4 tells us plainly, "There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them." 6 sons of God. Human daughters. Giants as the result, that's it, that's all Genesis gives you. One sentence and then the text moves on as if nothing extraordinary happened. But something extraordinary did happen, and the people who wrote the Book of Giants knew it. These weren't ordinary offspring. The Nephilim, the word itself rooted in the Hebrew nephil, meaning to fall, were described as beings of immense size and immense hunger. Not hunger for food alone, though ancient sources say that too, claiming the giants consumed entire harvests and then turned on livestock, and eventually turned on each other, and eventually turned on humanity itself. This wasn't metaphor to the people who lived through it, or who inherited the memory of it. This was a catastrophe with a body count. The Book of Enoch, which many of you already know from earlier videos on this channel, tells us that 200 watchers descended on Mount Hermon, bound by an oath, led by a being named Semjaza. The oath itself is worth sitting with. According to Enoch, the watchers bound themselves together with a mutual curse, agreeing that if any one of them turned back, the rest would hold him to the plan. That's not impulsive sin. That's premeditated rebellion, organized the way an army organizes before a campaign. They didn't fall by accident. They chose. They looked at human women and decided heaven wasn't enough. And their children, the Nephilim, grew not gradually, but violently, becoming giants whose height Jewish tradition sometimes measured in the hundreds of cubits. Whether you take that literally or as ancient hyperbole meant to convey overwhelming dread, the message is the same. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with the boundary between heaven and earth, and the wrongness was deliberate. The Book of Giants picks up where Enoch leaves a gap. It gives the giants names, Ohia, Hahia, Mahaweh. It gives them dreams, and this is where the text becomes almost unbearably human. In the surviving fragments, the giants themselves have nightmares. They see visions of their own destruction, tablets being washed by water, gardens uprooted, a coming judgment they cannot escape. One giant, Ohia, dreams of an orchard being destroyed, and the terror in that image isn't subtle. It's a civilization watching its own end arrive in a dream, powerless to stop it, and still choosing not to change course. That detail matters more than people realize. These were not mindless monsters. According to the fragments, they understood exactly what was coming, and they warred anyway. Because that's what the Book of Giants really preserves that Genesis doesn't, the war. Not a single flood narrative, but a prolonged, violent unraveling of the earth in the years before it. The giants fought each other for dominance. They fought humanity for resources. Some scholars who've studied the Qumran fragments closely believe the text describes a kind of internal collapse among the Nephilim themselves, brothers turning against brothers, a hierarchy of violence that mirrored the corruption their fathers had already brought down from heaven. It wasn't only humanity that needed to be judged. It was an entire supernatural rebellion that had built an army out of human flesh. Jude 1:6 seems to echo this same memory centuries later, describing angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, now held in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. That's not poetic language for ordinary sin. That's the language of a military tribunal, reserved for a rebellion severe enough to require chains strong enough to hold beings who were never meant to be bound at all. And this is where Numbers 13:33 becomes chilling rather than curious. When the spies returned from Canaan generations after the flood, they reported, "There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. Sons of Anak, descendants somehow of a bloodline the flood was supposed to have ended. If the giants were fully destroyed in the flood, why does Scripture keep encountering them afterward? The Book of Giants, read alongside Enoch and later alongside Numbers and Deuteronomy, suggests the war against this corrupted lineage didn't end with Noah. It only paused. That's the part institutional teaching rarely sits with. We're taught the flood as a clean reset, a single event with a single cause, human wickedness. But the ancient texts these communities preserved and then buried tell a stranger story, one where the wickedness had a very specific origin, a rebellion in the heavens that fathered a war on earth, and where the giants themselves, in their final hours, may have understood exactly what they had helped unleash. If any of this stirs something in you, if you feel that pull toward the parts of Scripture that were pushed to the margins, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Hit subscribe now, because we go deeper into these buried texts every single week, and you won't want to miss where this leads next. And if you want to hold all of this in your hands, not just hear it, we've put together something special. Our illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch. What it reveals about the Watchers, giants, and the world before the flood, walks through every piece of this hidden history, with full-color imagery that brings the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the pre-flood world to life in a way words alone can't capture. It's the kind of resource you'll return to again and again, not just read once and forget. You'll find the link waiting for you in the pinned comment below. If this world has ever felt just out of reach in your own Bible study, this guide is the bridge. The Aramaic fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran don't read like a smooth narrative. They read like torn pages from a battlefield diary, which in a strange way makes them more convincing, not less. Ancient forgers polish their stories. Ancient survivors leave gaps, half-sentences, names without context because they assume the reader already lived through what they're describing. The Book of Giants assumes exactly that. It assumes you already know the war happened. It's only interested in showing you what it felt like from the inside. And the inside of that war was terror layered on top of terror. Ohia and Haya, two of the giant sons named in the fragments, are shown consulting each other about dreams that won't leave them alone. In one, tablets are lowered from heaven and dipped into water until the writing dissolves, all except for a single line that survives. In another, a great gardener prunes an entire orchard down to its roots, sparing only a handful of trees. These aren't random nightmares. Ancient audiences would have recognized the imagery instantly, judgment descending, most of creation being cut away, a small remnant spared. The giants are dreaming their own flood before it arrives, and they know it. They send Mahaway, described as swift, to consult Enoch himself, hoping the last righteous man on earth can somehow interpret their way out of the sentence already written against them. He can't. And this is the moment the Book of Giants becomes less about monsters and more about the horror of watching judgment approach with total clarity and total helplessness. Enoch's answer, preserved in fragmentary form, offers no escape route. The rebellion of the Watchers has gone too far. The war the giants started against humanity, and increasingly against one another, cannot be undone by regret arriving after the violence is already finished. Because make no mistake, this was violence on a scale the text struggles to contain in a handful of surviving lines. Jewish tradition outside the Qumran fragments, including material preserved in the Book of Jubilees, describes the giants turning on each other in what's often translated as mutual destruction, brother against brother, tribe against tribe, until the earth itself was described as groaning under the weight of bloodshed it never asked to carry. Jubilees goes further than Genesis ever does, claiming the giants devoured not only livestock and grain, but eventually one another, a detail so disturbing that later scribes softened or omitted it entirely from more polished retellings. Genesis 6:11 captures the aftermath in a single devastating line. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Not sin in the abstract, violence, filled with it, a planet saturated. And Genesis 6:12 doubles down immediately after, telling us God looked upon the earth and behold it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. All flesh, not one nation, not one bloodline, everything. What's striking is how the Book of Giants frames the giants themselves, not as simple villains, but as beings caught inside a catastrophe their fathers initiated and they inherited without ever being asked. Some fragments suggest the giants pled for mercy, sending their dreams as a kind of appeal, hoping the God who judged their fathers might spare the sons who never chose to exist. It's a detail institutional teaching almost never mentions because it complicates the clean moral lesson most sermons prefer. The Nephilim weren't only perpetrators. In the text's own telling, they were also victims of a rebellion staged over their heads before they ever drew breath. That complexity is exactly why this book was suppressed for so long. A simple monster story is easy to preach around. A story where corrupted beings dream in terror of their own end, understand exactly what's coming, and still cannot stop the momentum of violence already set loose in the world. That's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about inheritance, about how corruption spreads once it's given a foothold, and about whether awareness alone is ever enough to change a fate already written. It's uncomfortable, in the same way modern audiences find generational trauma uncomfortable, because it suggests that sin doesn't stay contained to the one who commits it. It moves downstream. It settles into the next generation, whether that generation asked for it or not, and the giants, dreaming helplessly of their own destruction, may be the oldest recorded portrait of that exact inheritance. The Genesis Apocryphon, another Dead Sea Scroll closely tied to this material, adds a further layer, describing Lamech's suspicion that his own son Noah might not be fully human, so strange was the child's appearance at birth. Whether that reflects literal anxiety about angelic bloodlines mixing into humanity even at this late stage, or simply the pervasive fear that had settled over an entire generation, the underlying message is the same. By the time the giants were warring among themselves and dreaming of orchards stripped bare, no family felt safe from what had been unleashed. Trust between fathers and sons had become uncertain. Purity of lineage, something ancient societies guarded fiercely, felt like it was slipping away everywhere at once. This is the world Noah was born into, not a peaceful pre-flood paradise interrupted by a single random storm, but a civilization already unraveling under the weight of a war between giants, angels, and the remnants of a humanity caught in between. Whole regions had likely gone silent, entire family lines erased, and whatever social order once existed had collapsed into something closer to survival by force. When Genesis 6:9 tells us Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, it's not simply praising his personal character in isolation. Read against the Book of Giants, it reads almost like a battlefield report. Noah was the exception in a landscape where the exception had become vanishingly rare. And the giants knew their story was ending. The dreams told them so. The war they'd built told them so. Some fragments describe them waking from these visions not with resolve to change course, but with a kind of resigned fury, turning their fear outward instead of inward, which may explain why the violence only intensified as the end drew closer rather than easing. Fear rarely makes anyone gentler. It rarely did here either. What the fragments leave us with, right at the point where so much of the text has crumbled away over 2,000 years, is the image of Ohia and Hahia waiting, half in defiance and half in dread, for a judgment they'd already seen coming in their sleep, unable to outrun what their fathers had started on Mount Hermon. What almost nobody realizes is that the flood didn't end the story of the giants. It only ended one chapter of it, and the text itself seems to know this because the war language doesn't disappear from Scripture after Noah's Ark comes to rest. It resurfaces, generation after generation, under different names in different regions, as if the same corrupted bloodline kept finding cracks to slip back through. Deuteronomy 2:11 names them directly, saying of the Emim, which also were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Emims. A few verses later, Deuteronomy 2:20 does the same for another group, the Zamzummim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims. 3 separate names, 3 separate regions, all describing what is unmistakably the same phenomenon. This isn't Scripture mentioning giants once as a curiosity. This is Scripture cataloging them, region by region, the way a survivor might catalogue the enemy's remaining strongholds after a war that never fully ended. And that's really what these passages read like once you view them through the lens the Book of Giants provides. Not folklore scattered randomly through the text, but the aftershocks of a war that began on Mount Hermon, paused at the flood, and then continued wherever the bloodline found a way to persist. Whether through survivors who escaped the judgment or through a second incursion the text never fully explains, the giants came back. Og, king of Bashan, described in Deuteronomy 3:11 as sleeping in a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, was said to be of the remnant of the giants. 9 cubits works out to roughly 13 feet by conservative ancient measurement standards, a figure so far outside ordinary human proportion that later rabbinic commentators spent centuries trying to soften or explain it away rather than simply accept what the text plainly says. The remnant. Scripture's own word choice tells you something didn't get fully erased at the flood, no matter how complete that judgment is usually presented in Sunday sermons. This is where the Book of Giants becomes essential rather than optional for understanding the fuller picture, because it gives you the internal experience of the side that lost the first war, while Deuteronomy and Numbers give you the external record of the side that had to keep fighting the second one. The spies in Numbers 13:33 weren't reacting to legend when they said they felt like grasshoppers next to the sons of Anak. They were reacting to living descendants of exactly the bloodline the Book of Giants describes, dreaming of its own destruction generations earlier. The dream didn't fully come true. Not immediately. Not completely. Archaeology adds a layer here that most teachers skip entirely, not because it proves the giants directly, but because it shows something ancient civilizations kept building toward, structures that defy easy explanation, using only the tools and populations we assume existed at the time. Baalbek in modern Lebanon contains stones in its foundation, the so-called trilithon blocks, each weighing an estimated 800 tons, quarried and moved with a precision that still challenges engineers today. Local tradition for centuries associated the site with giants, long before archaeology gave anyone a reason to reconsider that folklore. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. Built by a population history textbooks insist shouldn't have possessed the organizational capacity for a project that scale, and yet there it stands. T-shaped pillars carved with animals and symbols nobody has fully decoded. Further south, sites like Pumapunku in the Bolivian highlands show similarly precise stonework, interlocking blocks cut with an accuracy that modern tools struggle to replicate without industrial machinery. Structures local legend has long attributed to a race of beings far larger and stronger than ordinary builders. None of this proves the Book of Giants word for word. That's not the claim here, and it never will be on this channel. But it does something almost as important. It removes the easy dismissal, the assumption that ancient people who wrote about giants and impossible feats of engineering were simply exaggerating or inventing stories to explain what they couldn't understand. Maybe. Or maybe they were describing imperfectly, and across centuries of retelling, something that actually left physical fingerprints on the landscape they inhabited. The Sibylline oracles, a body of prophetic material that circulated widely in the ancient Mediterranean world, describe a similar memory from a different cultural angle entirely, speaking of giants who warred against heaven itself and were struck down for their arrogance. The details shift with each culture that preserves the memory, but the shape of the story doesn't. Beings larger than ordinary humanity, born from a transgression against the natural order, warring and ultimately judged. Josephus, writing centuries later as a Jewish historian working under Roman patronage, also references the Nephilim directly, describing them as men of reproachful character, who trusted in their own strength and defied both God and the natural order that governed everyone else. What's remarkable isn't that one ancient text mentions giants. It's that so many independent traditions, separated by language, geography, and centuries, keep circling back to the same core memory. A war, a corrupted bloodline, a judgment that thinned the giants, but never fully erased them until much later, human history. Genesis 6:4 itself hints at this continuity almost in passing, noting that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after that, a phrase easy to skim past but nearly impossible to ignore once you know what the Book of Giants and Deuteronomy do with it afterward. Also after that, the war outlived the flood that was supposed to end it. If you trace the bloodline forward from Og of Bashan, through the Anakim that terrified the spies in Numbers, all the way to the giant Goliath standing in the valley of Elah centuries later, you're not looking at isolated incidents. You're looking at the long tail of a rebellion that started with 200 watchers on a mountain and never fully finished playing out, generation after generation, until one shepherd boy with a sling finally closed a chapter that had been open since before the flood. It's worth sitting with the fact that David, the one who ended Goliath, came from the smallest and least significant tribe by nearly every human measure, a detail that feels less like coincidence and more like the same pattern repeating itself across the whole of Scripture. The war against corrupted giants is never won by overwhelming force, but by the one figure everyone else overlooks. There's a question the Book of Giants forces you to confront that most Bible studies quietly avoid. Why did God choose water? Not fire, not plague, not the sudden collapse of the corrupted bloodline through some targeted judgment. Water, a flood that swallowed the entire known world. And when you read the giants' own dreams recorded in the fragments, tablets dissolving as they're dipped again and again into water until only a single line of text survives, you start to realize the method of judgment wasn't incidental. It was the point. Water throughout ancient Near Eastern thought wasn't simply destructive. It was a return to formlessness, a reversal of creation itself. Genesis 1:2 describes the earth before God's ordering work as being without form and void, with darkness upon the face of the deep. Waters covering everything before light, sky, and land were separated out into their proper places. Neighboring cultures across the ancient world carried echoes of the same idea, flood narratives that treated water not as one disaster among many, but as the primal substance creation itself had been drawn out of and could, under the right conditions, be returned to. The flood read against that opening image isn't just punishment, it's an undoing. God isn't merely killing the corrupted generation. He's dissolving the entire structure of a world that had been rebuilt wrong from the moment the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon, sending it back to the waters it came from so that creation can, in effect, begin again. That reframes everything the Book of Giants describes. The giants aren't dreaming about ordinary death. They're dreaming about their own erasure from the order of creation itself, a fate categorically worse than dying, because dying still leaves a place for you within the story. This doesn't. And that, more than any detail about their height or their violence, might be the real horror the text is trying to convey. The Watchers had tried to rewrite the boundary between heaven and earth, angel and human, spirit and flesh. The flood was God rewriting the boundary back, completely, without negotiation, using the same substance the world was originally spoken into order out of. 1 Peter 3:19-20 adds a strange and often overlooked detail to this picture, describing Christ after his death, going to preach unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a-preparing. Spirits in prison, disobedient in the days of Noah. Most scholars connect this directly to the fallen watchers described in Enoch and the Book of Giants, imprisoned rather than immediately destroyed, held for a judgment still to come. Some early church writers took this connection seriously enough to treat it as settled interpretation for centuries, before later theological traditions gradually shifted the emphasis toward a purely human reading. If that reading is correct, and a significant body of ancient and modern scholarship believes it is, then the war didn't fully end at the flood in any sense. It was paused, its architects imprisoned rather than erased, waiting for a final reckoning still ahead. That single detail changes how you have to read 2 Peter 2:4 as well, which states plainly that God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Chains. Reserved. Language that assumes ongoing custody, not closed casework. The rebellion on Mount Hermon didn't conclude with the flood. It transitioned into something closer to a holding pattern. an imprisonment awaiting a verdict Scripture describes as still pending, even from the vantage point of the New Testament writers, thousands of years after the events themselves. That gap between the crime and the final sentence is longer than almost anything else described in Scripture, and it's easy to miss simply because the waiting has stretched across so many generations that it no longer feels like waiting at all. This is where the Book of Giants, and the broader Enochic tradition it belongs to, start to feel less like ancient mythology and more like a missing legal record. The trial transcript Scripture assumes you already have access to, but never fully reproduces itself. Genesis gives you the verdict. Enoch and the Book of Giants give you the testimony. And what that testimony reveals again and again is a war fought not primarily on earth between armies, but in the space between heaven and earth, over the question of whether corrupted beings, once given power and territory among humanity, could ever be permitted to keep it. Every generation that followed inherited some version of that same unresolved question, whether they realized it or not. The Watchers believed they could rewrite that boundary permanently. Their oath on Mount Hermon, their choice to descend, their offspring's war against humanity, all of it reads as an attempt to establish a new, permanent order, one where the line between divine and human simply stopped applying to those strong enough to ignore it. The flood was the answer to that attempt, and it's an answer written in the same language the attempt itself was made in. Dissolution, reversal, a return to the water everything once came from. What the Book of Giants captures, better than almost any other ancient source, is what it felt like to be caught inside that answer while it was still arriving. The giants, half defiant and half terrified, sending their dreams to the one righteous man left standing, hoping against every available evidence that the sentence might still be negotiable. It wasn't. Ephesians 6:12 tells believers even now that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That phrase, spiritual wickedness in high places, reads entirely differently once you know the actual history it's describing. A rebellion that began literally on a high place, a mountain, with beings who thought altitude and authority meant they were beyond reach. It's not a coincidence, many scholars argue, that the language of spiritual warfare used throughout the New Testament carries the residue of this much older conflict, one whose opening chapter was written in Aramaic fragments, buried in a cave for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to read what the giants themselves already knew was coming. They weren't. And the flood that answered them wasn't random. It was precise, deliberate, and rooted in the exact grammar of undoing that creation itself had once used to bring order out of chaos in the first place. There's a reason so many cultures scattered across the ancient world, cultures that had no contact with one another, no shared language, no shared trade routes even, kept independently preserving the memory of a race of giants who warred against gods or heaven and were ultimately struck down. When you find the same core story in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in the Andes, in the biblical Near East, coincidence becomes a harder explanation to defend than the possibility that something real sat underneath all of it, refracted differently through each culture's own language and mythology, but pointing back at a shared point of origin. Mesopotamian tradition gives us the Anunnaki and figures like Gilgamesh, himself described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid being whose immense strength and restless defiance of mortal limits echoes the Nephilim template almost exactly. The Epic of Gilgamesh even preserves its own flood narrative, strikingly close in structure to Noah's story. A warning delivered, an ark constructed, a judgment survived by only a handful, suggesting the memory of this catastrophe was shared far more broadly across the ancient Near East than a single culture's scripture alone. Greek mythology gives us the Gigantes, born from the earth itself, who waged the Gigantomachy, a full-scale war against the Olympian gods, a story so structurally similar to the Watchers' rebellion that some early Jewish and Christian writers explicitly connected the two traditions. Believing the Greeks had preserved a corrupted memory of the same original event, scripture records more directly. And then there's South America, where Sacsayhuamán above Cusco displays megalithic stonework, using blocks weighing well over 100 tons each, interlocked with a precision that requires no mortar and has survived earthquakes that leveled colonial Spanish structures built centuries later using supposedly superior technology. Some individual stones there are cut with as many as 12 distinct angles, fitted so tightly that even a knife blade can't slide between them, a level of precision that remains genuinely difficult to explain using the tools historians assume were available at the time. Tiwanaku nearby shows similar impossible stonework alongside the Gate of the Sun, carved from a single slab of andesite. Local oral tradition in the region has long spoken of a race of giants who built these structures before being destroyed by the gods for their pride, a memory so specific and so consistent across generations that Spanish chroniclers recorded it directly from indigenous elders in the 16th century, centuries before anyone had a modern reason to connect it to a biblical framework. Yonaguni, submerged off the coast of Japan, adds a stranger wrinkle still, a formation of stepped, angular structures beneath the water that some geologists insist is entirely natural, while others point to right angles, straight edges, and what appear to be carved features inconsistent with pure erosion. Whatever Yonaguni ultimately turns out to be, its mere existence, debated and unresolved even among specialists, is a reminder of how much of the ancient world remains genuinely unknown, how much sits just outside the boundary of what mainstream historical narratives have agreed to accept as settled. None of these sites taken individually proves the Book of Giants. That's never been the claim, and it never will be. But taken together, a pattern starts to emerge that's difficult to write off as pure coincidence. Advanced engineering appearing in disconnected regions earlier than conventional timelines predict. Local memory in nearly every one of those regions independently pointing toward beings larger and more capable than ordinary humans. A near-universal story of divine war, pride, and judgment that shows up whether you're reading Genesis, Hesiod, or the oral histories preserved by Andean elders long before anyone told them what the Bible said. Skeptics are right to point out that pattern matching across cultures can be overstated, and this channel has never claimed otherwise. But the sheer breadth of the pattern, spanning continents that had no contact with one another for thousands of years, is worth more honest attention than mainstream history has generally been willing to give it. The Book of Giants sits at the center of that pattern in a way almost no other ancient text does, because unlike Greek mythology or Andean oral tradition, it isn't distant folklore reconstructed centuries after the fact. It's a fragment, however incomplete, of something written far closer to the event itself, recovered directly from a cave where it had sat undisturbed for 2,000 years, never edited to fit later theological comfort, never smoothed into a tidier narrative by scribes trying to make the material more palatable for congregations, centuries removed from the original context. That rawness is exactly why the text unsettled the religious authorities, who eventually chose not to include it in the canon. It doesn't explain away the horror. It doesn't resolve the moral complexity of beings who were simultaneously perpetrators and in some sense casualties of a rebellion they inherited rather than chose. It simply shows you the war from inside the losing side's own dreams and lets you sit with the discomfort of a story that refuses easy categorization into simple villains and simple victims. Daniel 4:13 gives us a small but striking parallel worth holding alongside all of this, describing a watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven using the exact term, watcher, that the Enochic tradition applies specifically to the angelic beings who fell on Mount Hermon centuries earlier. Whether Daniel's usage reflects a fully positive, obedient class of angelic beings separate from the fallen watchers, or an echo of the same terminology used more broadly across Jewish angelology, its presence confirms something important: the concept of watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe and interact with the earth, wasn't an invention unique to Enoch and the Book of Giants. It was part of a broader theological vocabulary the biblical authors assumed their audience already understood, evidence that this framework circulated widely enough in ancient Jewish thought to surface even in a book as central and canonical as Daniel, written centuries after the original rebellion, but still carrying its terminology forward intact. The giants, the watchers, the flood that answered their rebellion, none of it exists in isolation. It's a thread running through nearly every major ancient civilization, surfacing in different languages under different names, but circling back again and again to the same unsettling core. Something fell, something built, something warred, and something eventually judged. What remains, buried in fragments and scattered across continents, is the closest thing we have to eyewitness testimony from a world that no longer exists in any form we can fully reconstruct. The Book of Giants was buried for a reason, but it wasn't to protect you from the truth. It was buried because the truth refuses to stay comfortable, and comfort was never really the point of Scripture. Thank you for spending this time in the buried places of the text with us. If this reopens something in how you read Genesis, hit subscribe and stay close, because we're going back into these forbidden pages soon. Like this video, drop a comment telling us which detail stopped you cold, and let the next video already waiting on your screen carry you further into what the giants left behind. And if you want to hold this history in your hands, our illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is waiting in the pinned comment, full of the imagery this story deserves.